Hello everyone, this is International Master Jacek Stopa. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my games that I played over this last summer in the Evans Gambit. To follow up on the series of my lectures from a few months ago, I played a young German player of around 2200 rating. I was in the middle of the tournament. It was an important game I needed to win in order to be able to have a chance at winning the tournament. Which I eventually won a second time I played the tournament. And here it comes. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and b4. Okay, so we're entering the Evans Gambit. Bishop takes b4, c3, and here my opponent chose the move bishop e7, which is one of the principal continuations here in this position. And I chose the less known move queen b3 as opposed to the main line, which I talked about, the move d4. Queen b3 is a more dangerous option here for white. It immediately creates pressure against the f7 pawn and pretty much forces black to make an only move here in this position. It's knight h6. The thing about queen b3 is it will lead to positions that are a little more irrational than the move d4, and like I said, it's less known. It's also regarded as not as good of a move as d4, but it takes a lot of precision for black to be able to prove that. And after knight h6, which is the only playable move in that position, now d4. This move is pretty much a necessary continuation in all of the Evans Gambit, without which no initiative in the center is possible. And after d4, there's again not much choice black has. And knight a5 is a forced continuation as the knight on h6 was hanging. And if, let's say, black decides to castle, I can just take on h6. And in this position, a few continuations may follow. For example, I can even take on e5. I will always have some initiative against the king due to the very bad pawn structure on the king side and the exposed part of the g file, which I can take advantage of later. So, like I said, knight a5 is a forced continuation. And right now, queen b5. The idea being that, as actually happened in the game, after knight c4, I will capture on h6, and then g takes h6, queen takes c4. So one may ask, why not queen a4 with the same idea to eliminate options like, let's say, c6 here, which is a valid move. So after queen a4, knight c4, if I want to perform the same idea on the knight on h6, then knight b6 and I end up down a piece. So that doesn't really work. That's why queen b5 is the move here. And now my opponent took on c4. But let's see what happens after the interesting c6 option, which also leads to a normal play, where after queen e5, black has two options here in this position. First of all, black can just play f6, so like the g7 pawn is hanging. Black is defending the pawn and threatening the queen away. Queen h5 check, and g6. So white is getting the knight on h6. First, the important bishop f8 to make sure that the queen's not going to come to g7 with a very dangerous attack. So bishop f8 kicks the queen out. Queen h4. Knight c4. castles d6 and rook e1 leaves a slightly more pleasant position for white. It's not that easy to get to the king, especially that black ends up having a pair of bishops. The king may seem a little weak, but it has some options. In some cases, it can just castle king side or even queen side in some variations. But the truth is that the center does leave white a more pleasant position. So I wasn't really afraid of this. And in this position, knight c4 is also possible. Queen g7, rook g8. And queen h7 with some real complications. For example, rook g2. Now we take the knight. And d5. So black's king is weak, but not as weak as we would want it to be. Basically, it's one of those positions that are really double-edged, and white just never knows whether white's own king will end up being in danger at some point, especially due to the pair of bishops on black's side. And like, for instance, after d5, knight d2, knight d2, and like, let's say if white is going for the kill after knight e5, okay, with the double checkmate threat. Here, black just has this move knight f3 now, for example. And knight f3, the position is, I think, slightly more pleasant for white. Although, like I said, it's more of a double edge. So if white's initiative doesn't prove to be successful, then the pair of bishops could be very dangerous. So coming back, that was the move c6 here in this position. But my opponent, who later told me that he never saw this variation before, chose knight c4, which looks like a more logical move, and looks like it's not going to create that as much mess as c6 would. So knight c4, and bishop h6. Now again, after the queen a4 instead of queen b5, which I mentioned, now black again has a way of catching a tempo on the queen, but this time I have queen e5, okay, making it impossible for black to capture on h6, okay, because the rook will be gone. So after knight d6, queen e5, black has to play f6 and g6. And now after queen d5, the position is really unclear. And if, for example, black is trying to get the pawn on e4 after c6, then queen b3, and after knight e4, bishop g7 just basically wins the exchange, showing how vulnerable black's king side is, okay, because the g8 square is controlled. So rook g8 is impossible, rook is threatened, rook has to go to f8, and we just grab the exchange. So that's not exactly possible for black. But in this position, knight f7 is entirely possible, and the position is double-edged. Now if bishop g7, then now the bishop is essentially gone after rook g8. So white has to play something like bishop e3. And now again, pair of bishops, white has a nice center, though. So it's quite an unusual position, actually, looking at black's king side. Maybe it doesn't look exactly the way black would like it to be. But still, like I said, the pair of bishops, and there are some options like playing c6, d5 later on. I still prefer white a little bit, just because the center is so nice, and it looks like the king will be safer than black's. But again, I have some experience in speed chess here in these positions, and I know it's not so easy to play for white. Another option, instead of f6 in this position, is the less intuitive knight e4. Now, this may create some real mess if white decides to play something like d5, okay, because let's say if I take, which I guess is the main move here that I was looking at, g takes h6, d5 is also possible right now. Again, black ends up having the pair of bishops. White is down a pawn, but again, right, so the king is weak. Whites will be much safer if I castle it kingside. I'm going to be able to probably take advantage of the e-file. I don't think black will be fast enough to secure the king safely before I get my rook on the e-file. And then I'll be able to lift it up, like the rooks, through the d and e files, and potentially threaten the king when it comes to g8 or h8. Right, black has the vulnerable pawn structure on the king side. So again, something for something. And like I said, d5 is also possible. Again, leaving an unclear double-edged position. If bishop g7, then simply rook g8. Okay, so there's no way to win the piece, because whenever I'm going to be going for the knight, the bishop's gone. Okay, this time white got the pawn back, but first of all, it was a very weak pawn here on h6, and second, black got an extra tempo here to get the rook onto the g-file. So again, hard to tell to whose advantage that is, but no real advantage for either side. Unclear position with not much theory in here, definitely worth exploring a little deeper. But my opponent chose to take on h6, okay? And after queen c4, e takes d4. So the position got a little simplified. Here, instead of e takes d4, d6 is also possible to immediately open up the bishop. And let's say after d takes e5, just castle immediately, okay? So black is trying to match white's development and open up the positions, giving up a pawn to make sure the position's a little more open so that the bishops can get some more play. And let's say bishop e6. Now white can try to be tricky after e5. Of course, bishop c4 is not possible as two pieces will be hanging. So something like queen c5 may follow. And castles, which leaves an interesting endgame where the amount of pawns is even. White has a slightly better pawn structure. But again, black has the pair of bishops. So I think it's a rough equality in this particular case. So I didn't really expect anything special from the opening playing queen b3. I knew it wasn't probably the most accurate move. I know d4 is an objectively better option. But again, I figured out my opponent was not going to be familiar with this variation. So I was hoping for some complications. And I did manage to get them. My opponent took on d4. C takes d4. And rook g8. I think till this point, he's playing very accurately. I had this position in my analysis when playing the game, and my evaluation was it's a roughly equal position. But I knew that it's much easier to play this position for white, okay, for the reasons that I've mentioned so many times. The king's basically going to be much safer. Black is going to have to solve the problem of the king on e8, which way to castle it. Well, right now, I guess there's only one option of castling. But as we will later see, my opponent will not solve this problem very well. Even though so far, yeah, I think the move rook g8 is the most accurate option. So I basically don't believe in the king being castled kingside in this variation, as that would simply leave it too vulnerable because of the g file. Okay, so it's good to get the rook out early onto g8, especially that black can create some pressure here on g2, which, for example, after the most logical move, which is castle, gives black a nice counterplay after d5. Okay, takes and bishop h3. And now after knight e1, queen d7, it looks like now this time black's king will be safe, and white's king may potentially get in trouble. For instance, in the knight d2 variation, it actually bishop g2 wins for black right away. Okay, knight g2, queen h3 is a checkmate. But of course, I don't need to do that. And let's say if a move like king h1 comes, Bishop f5 is an equal amount of pawns, and black has the pair of bishops. White's pieces are not exactly where they should be. There is no immediate attack against the king on e8. It may go to f8 or even castle in some cases. Okay, and the pawn will be weak on d5. Right, so I think this position, white doesn't really have too much to hope for, and black is entirely fine. So that's why I didn't castle kingside here and played g3 instead. Instead of g3, there's also a sharper option here in this position, and that's knight e5, threatening to checkmate immediately here on f7. But black is fine after d5. Rook g2. And if d6, just simply queen d6 pacifies all threats, queen f7, king d8, and there's not really too much to do. And it again looks like white king will be weaker this time. The position got opened a little bit, and I think the pair of bishops will be much more dangerous than white's attack against the black king on d8. So I didn't like knight e5. And g3 looks like the best option here for white. And now in this position, I had only looked at c6 and d5, which are both perfectly playable moves. And I knew that if black plays accurately, then white doesn't have too much after either option. But my opponent chose the relatively more peaceful d6, which looks like the most logical move. But for some reason, it never occurred to me that black could follow this path when preparing for the game or when looking at this variation before. So let me look at the other alternatives first. For example, d5, right? So again, black is trying to create the counterplay immediately, open up the bishop, and disrupt the center a little bit. E takes d5 and bishop h3, right? So black is preventing the kingside castle, aggressively playing bishop g3, threatens moves like bishop g2, winning a piece. Knight bd2 and king f8. So black is getting the king out of the dangerous e file. f8 may look like a dangerous square for the king, but there's not really too much white can do about that. If, for instance, knight e5, threatening d6, black can just block the pawn playing bishop d6, and it doesn't really seem like there's any dangerous attack here to follow up. White can play something like castle queenside. The position again is double-edged, and I'm not sure who's better here, objectively. But again, there are plenty of complications, so it leaves plenty of potential for developing some initiative. Or after knight bd2, black can also choose a slightly more aggressive option, bishop g5, attacking the knight on d2, which could matter in some variations. And now if knight e5, again trying to get d6 done, black can simply play f6 and go for these complications. d6, right, threatening the rook on g8. Rook g7, f4, right? So like some real mess comes around. But this position should favor black this time. So the beauty of this variation lies in that there are those both-sided attacks at each other's kings at the same time that sometimes you just never know whose king will end up in more danger. And this time, even though this king looks so exposed, it will be the white's king that will suffer more, as ironically, as the files open, black king will be perfectly fine this time, right? And the white's king unable to castle either way. Okay, illegal onto the king side. And if castles queenside, then rook c8 leaves black a very comfortable edge. But again, white doesn't have to go for that. And after bishop g5, queenside castle is possible, again, with a very double-edged position. And the other continuation that I was looking at was the move c6, with two options now for white. First being the castle, now d5, counterattacking here in the center again, and trading the queens. Okay, leaving this endgame. This position may look like it's clearly to black's favor, as black is not only up a pawn but has the pair of bishops. But first of all, it's not an open position, as the d5 pawn will become really weak in some variations, and white has the dynamic knight b5, okay, threatening knight c7, forcing a move like king d8, and after rook ac1, it looks like white has the initiative, creating some potential threats here. White's pieces are basically going to be more active here. So I evaluated this endgame as slightly better for white. And knight c3 is the other option here in this position, essentially preventing d5 if white didn't feel like going for the endgame, trying to keep the pressure against the king. And now b5, okay, so black is trying to take advantage of the majority of the pawns on the queen side and just push them immediately. b4, knight e2, and a5, okay, preparing the move bishop a6 onto the a6 f1 diagonal to activate the pieces a little bit. But again, that leaves white some time, pushing these pawns here, leaves white some time to develop a stronger initiative on the king side, playing e5 to gain more space, okay, attacking the pawn on h7. And after rook g7, white can just castle and play queen e4. Okay, leaving what I think is a significant advantage here for white, as it will be really hard for black to do something about this majority, especially that white will at some point create pressure of this sort. Knight f4, knight h5, or just basically remaneuvering the knights in any way. For example, playing d5 later on, trying to get d6 down, or maybe e6. Okay, knight d4, knight f5. Just it looks pretty horrible for black. So I wasn't afraid of either of the two options, c6 or d5. But d6, again, the move my opponent chose, is a very logical option. And as it later turned out, it wasn't so easy for me to prove advantage here for white. But let's conclude at this point the first part of the video with the theoretical part of the Evans Gambit. In the second part, I will cover the rest of the game, which involves a very imbalanced position, which was basically my idea of going for this variation. And I'll show you some intricacies of the later part of the game that can arise in the Evans Gambit. Thank you very much for watching.